Good evening, and welcome once again to the Center for Applied Theology and Urban Abbey's Foundation Year program for our 9th session. Tonight we are pleased and privileged to have with us Professor Josef Lössl, Professor of Historical Theology and Intellectual History at Cardiff University. He will be leading us through what is arguably one of Western literature's most important works, Augustine's Confessions. Now, I know that this has a potential to generate a great deal of discussion, so I won't hold us up with a lot of introductory talk, but I will hand it over instead to Father David Harris to get us started with the first question.
Professor, thank you so much for being with us. My question is very, very simple. This is such a unique work to kind of burst into the world when it did. Possibly one of the most, after St. Paul, possibly one of the most influential theological and philosophical works. Why did Augustine sit down to write it? Like, what was going on that made him come up with this, incredibly unique literary genre?
Okay, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the question. I hope that this is also, James told me that it's going to be also more like a conversation as well. So I hope so you have to stop me when I start rambling. And thanks for this first question, because in a way, a lot of what Augustine wrote was, as it were, occasional. So he wasn't really like a professional writer. He was a bishop at the time. He was just bishop for a few years in 395-6, and then it was probably in 397 that he started writing the Confessions and probably finished them around 400. It was around that period, the end of the 4th century. And it's a good question. Why did he write this? Because it's very unusual for a bishop to write such a revealing work about your personal past. But that may be actually the reason. Some people, he doesn't say a lot about it himself. He doesn't actually say why he wrote it. At the end of his life, he says people liked it. It wasn't actually, contrary to what some of the earlier conversations suggested, it wasn't meant to be a difficult work to read. It was meant actually to be read by everyone who can read, or being read to people. And he said that people liked it. It was a very it has a very lot of personal stuff in it, and lots of interesting stuff which he thought people liked. But historians think that he may have been forced to write it because his past could have become an issue. We don't know so much about it, but he did have a past, as becomes clear from the Confessions. And one of the aspects of his past was the fact that he had been a Manichaean for quite a long time in his life, probably for about 10 years. And that is an important part of the Confessions. And it's now believed that actually it is written with a view to a lot of his friends he still had, who were still Manichaeans or leaning in that direction, to appeal to them, to try and move them also to convert to orthodoxy. So I'm not saying too much about the content here, but that's clearly, it's an occasional, it's on that occasion. It's not so unique. You said it's a unique genre as a kind of an autobiography. When people are looking back, this type of genre was known in antiquity. There are some kind of examples of ancient writings that are similar, but he did make it into something quite unique, something that stands at the end of antiquity and then shines forth has an afterlife, which is quite remarkable until the present day.
Was it read mainly in his own diocese, or would it have gone out of North Africa?
It's when Augustine writes, one of the immediate, right, because you have to imagine Augustine was living in a monastic context. So he was living in a community of monks, or of those kind of what later became the Augustinian canons, you know, in the cathedral. And that was his immediate context. And when he mentions later in the retractations, he says the brothers like it. So I think immediately he thinks of his religious community and maybe a wider circle, but maybe other bishops or other kind of clerical people, or anyway, people with a spiritual interest.
Do we know whether Ambrose ever saw a copy of it?
I think Ambrose was already dead by that time.
So he probably didn't see a copy
Ambrose
of it.
died, I think, in 296, I think. Yeah, no, Ambrose did. Ambrose wouldn't. Other famous people from Augustine's lifetime, I couldn't. No, I think you'd have to think of later people, like, for example, Jerome would have been one, but I don't think he ever wrote, he would have been interested in it. Yeah, so I mean that's in that sense also an interesting question, because it does project, or it expresses quite a very specific type of spirituality, which is not everybody's, even not every ascetic's kind of diet. So there are people who might not like it for the very reason why Augustine, where Augustine, the way he expresses himself and what's important to him. I mean, I kind of, I'm getting a little bit into it in preparation for this, what I was thinking, what is actually Augustine's unique selling point there? And that is something that, which is, if you get into the Confessions, it's about emotions. It's about being emotional. And it's about doing things out of a desire. So Augustine, if I may, I mean, I'm already now in summarizing, but you may contradict me on that, because this is a bit of, maybe a bit provocative. So the way I have been reading this lately, that Augustine wouldn't do anything unless he really had a desire for it. And so in order to, so if he really wanted to get out of his bad desires, he had to actually learn how to desire what he knew what was good. And that's really what the Confessions are about. How do you actually shift from desiring what's not good for you in terms of salvation to what's good for you? And many people are not like that. They think, you know, I keep desire out of it, I make a decision and then I act on it. So they are much more decisionistic, whereas for Augustine that wasn't good enough. And I think that's what the Confessions, or this is on the personal side of the Confessions, is about.
I'd like to come in and ask a question now about, so commonly it's seen as being a sort of spiritual autobiography. And this may have some resonance to us within other works of similar that were written later on, like by John Bunyan or others in that movement. Is it fair to see it as being, this text as being a spiritual autobiography? Are there other ways in which we can look at this text?
Yeah, again, where I came from a kind of a scholarly analysis and the tradition of a scholarly study of the Confessions, it's been frowned upon in the kind of modern research to look at it as, say, a spiritual autobiography in this way, because it's more than that. You know, you say you have those 9 books which are autobiographical, and then you have book 10, which is very strongly theological, but also psychological, if you like, about memory. And then you have books 11 to 13, which is really an exegesis of Genesis 1, of the creation and the first book of Genesis. So the people who look at the 13 books as a whole, they say, no, you can't just look at it as an autobiography and so on, it's more than that. But I think I've come to this to say, no, but there is so much autobiography in it, and it is actually to kind of say the autobiographical parts are not as theologically deep or as theologically solid or penetrating as the other parts would be a mistake. It is autobiographical, and it is meant to be. But also, I assume this is also the motive, the intention of other spiritual autobiographies, is that the reader identifies with the author, or the reader is kind of applying the developmental things in the biography to their own experience and to their own lives, and so kind of go this path themselves as they are reading it and reflect on their own lives. So yes, I mean, it is autobiographical in that respect, but it is, of course, right from the beginning, has a theological agenda and a spiritual agenda. So, as you know, it's designed the way it's actually a prayer. The entire, so when it starts as a prayer, and then if it falls into the prayer mode again and again and again, even though you have actually narrative bits in between, but it is like an ongoing prayer. The prayer is not so much Augustine's own words; it's actually Psalms. A lot of the prayer are simply a series of Psalm quotations from the Psalms, and the aim, when you say autobiography, that it's about himself, it's not about him. It's actually, and he says it's about God. He just wants to draw attention away from him to his relationship with God, and actually to the importance of the presence of God in his life. So with all these qualifications, I would say yes, it is a spiritual autobiography, but then it is, if you then don't get stuck in the auto aspect of that, but go beyond that.
That's wonderful, thank you. I'd like to jump in now if that's okay. So in the Confessions, we see Augustine wrestling with lots and lots of different topics. We've got the more obvious ones, such as sin, the nature of sin, how we live a good life, how we can make ourselves want to live a good life. Seems to be as we've touched on, a really quite a bit topic. But he also wrestles with things such as the nature of cognition and memory, matter, the creation of the universe. And all of this vastly predates modern advances in psychology, sort of brain biochemistry, psychiatry, atomic physics. So with all of this in mind, after all of this time, because 1600 years has elapsed between now and then, is it still possible to read the Confessions with any benefit?
Yeah, I think you thankfully, gratefully gave the answer to this question. Yes, because yeah, it is, anyone who picks them up will be surprised about the contemporary interest that is in there. But again, as I kind of contradicting myself a bit, it is in a way, a decidedly unmodern book, or a decidedly, how do you call it, a kind of a reactionary book or so. It's not like he thinks things through, and then he gets really very interesting, say, scientific insights, even, as you say, cosmological, psychological, linguistic, and so on. But then he takes the turn, and he actually because spirituality and God and his relationship with God is his primary interest, he actually looks as if he is despising all these things. So one thing that comes to my mind again and again is the way he looks down on natural science. There's because you were earlier saying you were reading the later books, and it must be, I don't know, it's in one of the later books, 12 or 13, I don't know exactly. He writes about again, the English fails me. You know, when you are dissecting bodies.
Okay, yeah.
Do you remember that? Can you remember such a passage? He says about dissecting dead bodies. So medics were doing that at the time because they were interested in anatomy and they wanted to find out. They wanted to know more about the body, and of course, when people died of diseases, they wanted to know what, you know, is the liver has increased, or was there a problem? Was there a tumor in the stomach or something like that? And he goes on about this for quite a little bit, and he says how disgusting this is and how useless this whole thing is, because why would people do that? This has absolutely there's no point in doing that, because, you know, compared to if you can actually just meditate and you think about your spiritual life, you know. And you know, modern people who are the way we are wedded to modern science nowadays, you know, especially in this day and age, you know, like we're all pinned to the screens and saying, when do they discover a vaccine or so? Augustine would have, I mean, he would remind me. I actually earlier today I heard that there was the Dalai Lama was on TV, and he was basically his message to humanity was, don't worry, because if there is a vaccine, there's, you know, that you don't have to worry, and if there's no vaccine, there's no use to worry. I think that would have been, that's a bit like, that's what Augustine would have said, something like that. And but that didn't prevent this attitude to being as a whole and to humanity and to the world, did not prevent him from doing this very meticulous research, because he was a thinker. He was interested in the detail of reality. So he would say, how does language work? So, like, as you say, for the child, how do we actually start speaking? Where does language come from? How does education work? Why is beating children in school, why does it not work? Why is it kind of stupid to do that? And so on and so on. So he was really interested in everything, and he explored everything. But ultimately, he was above that. He was kind of moving above that. And so in that sense, it makes him in the Confessions, it makes it a lot of sense to read the Confessions today, maybe to be a bit critical, or be also critical of some of his kind of prejudices, or kind of his even theological positions, and also this attitude, because we live in a world that is dominated by natural science, but maybe also reading something like the Confessions may also help us to kind of lift ourselves beyond that, so that we don't get caught up in it too much, because there is a danger that we are kind of completely absorbed in our material world. And so in that sense, it's a guide, but it's also an inspiring, stimulating to engage with reality in a philosophical way.
Yes, I think when you mentioned the part of the book that talks about dissections, I'm not sure if I've gotten to that part yet, but I know there is a part where he's really quite critical of people who are, the subject of curiosity comes up, doesn't it?
Yeah,
he's really
that's
quite
what
critical.
it's connected. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's critical of people pursuing knowledge for knowledge's own sake. And when I read that, it seemed, okay, that's what we're doing here at St. Giles and Reading. But as I sort of thought about it, reflected on it a little bit, and took it in the broader context of what he's talking about, it rather seems that Augustine obviously is not anti-intellectual. It's more that he is encouraging us not to pursue certain areas of knowledge and inquiry at the expense of investigating the bigger questions and the things which indeed
Yeah.
apply to the well-being and the salvation of the soul. Would you agree that that's the case?
Yeah. Well, and I think that makes him controversial. I mean, he's controversial in several directions. So he's controversial within the Christian tradition. Say, when you think about later with Thomas Aquinas and the kind of more the focus on the individual and the focus on the on creation, of kind of taking the world more seriously. So he has Augustine has this image of being the Platonist who is looking for the universal and then kind of forgets about the particular. He is controversial then with modernity, what you mentioned about curiosity, because if say Augustinianism as an ideology, it would suppress scientific development precisely because of that, because it would say, why do you do that? It leads nowhere. Of course, you may save millions of people's lives, but ultimately, what's gained by that? So that is, you know, if that kind of attitude would come out of Augustine, that would be clearly, you know, a problematic. The question is whether Augustine himself had that attitude to that extent, because the vices he is basically addressing, there's curiosity, then there's the other two. The one is the lust for power, and then also the lust for pleasure. So those are basically these three areas, so he is using that as in a psychological way to, as I said about the desire. He says, if the desire is for power, then you can gain power and you lose yourself in the process. And the same for physical pleasure, and then of course the same for intellectual pleasure, because you find out all these things, you win Nobel Prizes and so on, and then in the end, what's left there for you? So that's basically what these are questions. If you read this in the Confessions, it may not be so much as a kind of a program for a kind of educating for an educational program, but it's more like a self-analysis of saying where does it lead him, and but I do recognize it's a problem. There's a problem of Augustinianism there, where if you follow that, you may end up, say, becoming a theologian rather than a physicist, for example. So,
yeah, perhaps implying an incompatibility between the two, which isn't there.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I think as an individual, you will have to make choice. You may have to make choices, and the thing is, as you say, when Augustine does actually. He does explore things. He does get into the details of things. So it's not that he is not interested in science. He just says, don't make it into your religion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, that's not exaggerated. Because that would, you can still become a biochemist and do research all your genes and do your stuff. Although, and this may be going into an area where I'm not an expert anymore, but I think many people who are in these jobs today are doing things which, say, even, 2 or 3 generations ago would have been considered pretty hairy. We're getting into, what you do to the human person and that kind of thing. And you are pushing these boundaries, and then you have to ask yourself, where is it still humanly responsible to do this? And that's clearly even in that sense, you can apply Augustine's thinking to these problems. It's the same with other problems. I mean, I did some studies, I mean, that's not so much in the confession, you know, he is reflecting on labor, for example, human labor, and what is, you know, doing physical work in his time was being despised. You know, people who had to do physical work, it was usually slaves or very lowly people, and anyone who was above a certain level would not touch any physical work. And in the monastery, everybody had to do physical work. So when people of a better status came into the monastery, they would say, no, this is against our human dignity. We are not touching a broom, or we are not doing this or that. So it was him who was explaining to them that in fact, it's not diminishing your human dignity, it's actually establishing your human dignity to do physical labor. But he also said to those who came from more lowly background, he said, you know, physical labor is not there to give you pleasure or to gain you wealth, because many artisans in his time, they got very wealthy because the richer people actually couldn't do anything, so they could charge whatever they liked. So he says, it's not there for you to gain a lot of wealth, it's there for your humanity. So this is almost, you know, a kind of, you know, some people might call it socialism or something, but it's that kind of thinking where you have to keep things in balance to see where he is coming from and where he's going to. And I think an extreme version of Augustinianism is taking it beyond where Augustine himself would have wanted it to go. But it's just a thought about him as also as a person and as an author.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to jump in now with a question that in many ways I think changes the tone somewhat, and that is just to look at, perhaps you might call it the reception of Augustine, in the sense that I think there are a number of caricatures out there of Augustine as something of a human pessimist. And the charge is leveled on the basis of his apparent obsession with human sin. Now, I'm just wondering, it might sound like a funny way of phrasing it, but is it bad for a person's mental health to read the Confessions, considering that apparent sort of obsession that Augustine himself seems to have?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, that's one, nowadays, yeah, you'd have to, this is what we kind of, it's not unknown to me as a lecturer, that you have to kind of apply a health warning to some of the content. And that, I mean, it's not so much if you read it. I think if you are reading it, then there could be kind of shocking things that you come across. I mean, not so much where people not in a kind of a shocking, you know, like in a graphic way or so, but it's more like things you discover about yourself, and then saying, I've never thought about it this way, and then it actually hits you. And I don't think that's necessarily what you mean, but it has to do with what we said earlier, that Augustine is known to emphasize so much the importance of God, say the divine presence in your life, and it creates this kind of impression that the worth of the human is less, or that you yourself would be nothing, or you would be kind of with your own powers, you would definitely not be able to do good. And, you know, in a way, in these Christian terms, you would, all your effort for yourself, your own effort would only get you to hell. There is no way, you know. And this is really the extreme form. And it was actually ultimately what the kind of thinking he developed. It's not, he then tried himself to apply it in a way that was to kind of make it more palatable to people, and saying, you know, you can have hope, you know, don't despair, but it was very dramatic. He had this very dramatic idea that you are, as you are entering this journey, you are risking your own salvation. If you are not picked up by grace, you are dropping into the abyss. There is no salvation for you, and that is a, you know, a dangerous, and I probably, being responsible, I have to address this when I'm talking about Augustine, and you can't just sanitize him and saying he is ultimately, he's a great humanist and so on, which he isn't, but he has also this really, there's something dark in it as well, and yeah, and it also comes through in the confessions. Although I personally, I must say, I never experienced it like that. When you read through the confessions, there's lots of dramatic things are happening, and he's led astray. It's in fact quite unhappy over long periods. He's crying a lot. He loses a lot of friends. People are dying. Lots of tragic things are happening. He has to go away from home. Then there's the heartbreak with his lover, and lot of with his son. His son is dying. His mother is dying. So that's actually what's really on the forefront of it. But underneath this, as I already mentioned earlier, is also this thought that if I do. And that's why he's crying out to God all the time. You know, if I do not make a connection there, and it's not up to me, it's actually, I'm just being, if I'm hoping in this hope and in this crying out and in my prayer, I hope that I'm going to be picked up by grace, because otherwise I will be lost. And that is clearly, can put a mental strain on you, and I think that it has to be addressed somehow to kind of say, you know, don't despair, focus on life. You know, develop an attitude of hoping, of having hope, and of being positive. So in that sense, you know, it's not that Augustine doesn't want you to be positive, and that's not the pessimism, but it is the counterfoil of that, to say, I mean, what actually, what alternative? So what alternative does he put up, project there, and is that? And I think that would be then for theologians to discuss, because that's the Pelagian controversy, really, to say, is what he is putting up there, is that a valid theological point, or is there a problem there? Is there a problem deep down in his thought? And that's actually what I started with. This problem is coming from his Manichaean background. This is how he had learned to think about his own personal development, about his salvation. So so that would maybe going a bit too far, because that's I might start rambling, because if you then say, okay, we find this kind of thinking in St. Paul, well, the kind of St. Paul the young Augustine was reading, he read together with his Manichaean friends, and they put a certain spin on that, which is that there is a large part of humanity which is going down into darkness, and if you want to go into the light, you have to have certain qualities. And
see, by answering with that,
yeah.
you've preempted my next question, but you've also given rise to a new one within me, and that is, I was going to ask about the place from which this sort of emphasis on individual responsibility and human sin emerges, whether in terms of the literature to which he was exposed, which you've suggested, you know, is actually engendered within the Manichaean sort of circle, but also sort of the wider sort of the sort of Western Latin culture in which he's formed. Because, you know, you'll remember, because you and I have talked about this personally, but you know, I've referred to sort of, you know, his Eastern counterparts and the difference in language that they use in terms of to whom sin is attributed and the sort of sinful nature of humanity, where in I hate drawing, you know, using blanket terms like East and West, but in the East, broadly speaking, you don't get that that emphasis on the individual, and yet. In some ways, I accept your answer. I think it's interesting. I'll have to sort of explore the Manichaean sort of route. But actually, when I look at Ambrose, his vocabulary is not dissimilar to Augustine's in the sense that Ambrose also speaks of the individual in a way that Augustine picks up, or in a way that Augustine also does. And that seems to represent a distinction that could be made between sort of, broadly speaking, the East and the West. And I wonder if there's is there any truth to that?
It is, I think one way of overcoming this, I mean, because I myself, when I follow this train of thought, you know, I'm talking myself into a corner, into a dark corner, so to speak. There's a way of trying to look at it differently, and that is the common heritage between the Eastern and the Western fathers, and that has been researched, is this the Platonist kind of backdrop, that actually when they're talking about this infinity, this kind of openness, and also, as you say, the universality of reality and of God, so that there is this kind of big other out there, and which is actually not negative, which is actually something I can feel at home in if I really discover what it really is or who it really is. Then but it's also, and that's also, I think, in the East, it's also terrifying. Mm-hmm. It is also demanding of you self-abnegation. It's demanding asceticism, ascesis. It's demanding giving up yourself and to actually, not being obsessed with yourself. So if you put it like that, there is I think, a common background, and I think I always believed also in that, because I personally, I was always, there were accidents. The reason why I became involved with Augustine is also there's a lot of accidental aspects to it as well. And then you are stuck with this, and you discover that there are many people who don't like Augustine, and especially in the East, he has such a bad reputation. And I'm wondering, he's a church father, so what is wrong with that? And also, he is the author of on the Trinity, and yet he which is a unsurpassed kind of work of theology, where you hardly have a notion of this kind of these problematic aspects of the theology of grace, and I think one of the ways to square that, and again to come back to the Confessions, the Confessions is a work where a lot of this is coming together, is to simply say he's ultimately positive, and if you pursue on your spiritual path, there is nothing you need to worry about. This is God is going to help you, and the other thing is what I said right at the beginning. You are being drawn to it. So if the desire for God is picking you up, then you are on the way. It's just to get there, because it's like first you actually don't want to go there. There's this famous thing also. I said a lot is in book 8 there, where he talks about this. It's this famous line about chastity, where he says, "Give me chastity, but not yet." Yeah. You don't. At the moment you have this experience, I actually don't want it, but he knows there may be a point, if you just keep pushing in that direction, there may be a point you are going beyond that, and actually there's something better there beyond that. And I think that's a common ground with the Eastern, or with it doesn't have to be this kind of, it's not such a narrow Western tradition, but it's more like a more universal spiritual experience, what then became known as mysticism also later. I mean, I think that concept really didn't exist in his time yet, but it developed in the later periods.
Thank you very much for that and for all of the questions you've answered so far. I'm now going to throw you to the lions by opening up the questions to the whole floor. And in that respect, would just ask everybody involved in the conversation right now to indicate either through the chat function or just by raising a hand and waving madly if you would like to ask any sort of question. I'm just, yes, Father Tom.
Hello, Professor, and thank you very much indeed. It's nice to be on this side of the questioning for a change. The last 2 weeks I've been on the other, in your shoes. No, I'm thinking I'd like to try to get to the heart of Augustine's spirituality in a way. He comes to Christianity quite late, doesn't he? You know, "Sero te amavi, pulchritudo, quam antiqua et tam nova, late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and so new." 387, he's baptized, age of 33.
Yeah.
And on the back of a religious kind of experience in the garden in Milan, if I'm right in thinking, and of course then there's the experience with Monica, with his mother, and even back in his Manichaean days at 19, the death of his father, you've got that impact of him becoming a Manichaean, and then like I think you pointed out, he's bewailing his loss of faith in the Manichaean faith as he meets Ambrose, reads the Neoplatonists, has a Neoplatonic sort of fuge monu pros monon, flight of the alone to the alone through some Neoplatonic meditative methods. And then when he becomes bishop, the focus just seems to shift, in at least what we've got, to this theology of grace, trying to preserve God's freedom in the controversies against the Donatists, the Pelagians, of course. So it often seems to me that the Reformation picks up the aspects of Augustine that I least like, frankly, the radical attempt to safeguard God's freedom. But where is Augustine's sacramental theology just a kind of safeguard to safeguard God's grace, ex opere operato? Is his spirituality really basically internal, Deus interior intimo meo, God deep within me? Where does his ecclesiology and sacramental communal theology and spirituality link in with his internal Platonic mysticism? Bearing in mind he also repudiates theurgy completely, unlike Dionysius as an Eastern counterpart. Do they connect, or is his theology, is his spirituality really internal?
Yeah.
A long question. Thank you.
Yeah, and that is a big question too, because obviously the absence of a more developed, say, sacramental theology, say of the medieval type, then enabled in the Reformation to kind of develop an alternative type of Christianity. So where you focus on that and you then leave the sacramental, the practice and the external, the ritual side aside, or you don't value that so highly. But that, of course, wasn't his practice. I haven't studied that so much, but I mean, from what I know, I mean, it was more like a developed or a practiced kind of the ritual practice was there, that was a given. And it's also in a way because you have said it quite nicely, because you have this once he's a bishop, and even when he was already a priest, so from the early 390s onwards, So then he is in the church service, and then that becomes much more his daily routine. And but still, even though it involved lots of different liturgical kind of activities, the preaching was the main thing for him, and that, in fact, that's what people were expecting of him. So that was that. And again, you might think that's accidental, but of course, then in the Reformation, this could be picked up and then kind of championed. But in fact, it was just because he was such a good rhetorician, and people just wanted to hear him. And before that, of course, these aspects, the ecclesial aspects, were not so important. So and this is what you mostly read in the confession. It's the personal path, the personal way he was going, and so there is not much ecclesial in there, because he was himself. In fact, he said that was one of the reasons why I joined the Manichaeans, because there was no church discipline. He could do what he wanted. He could do as much as he liked, and the kind of things he wanted to do. But interestingly, more recent research has shown that what the Manichaeans did in their meetings, they had these psalm singing sessions, and that's what you find also in the confessions. So there is this kind of really a love for this poetic language addressing God, and to really indulge in that and to develop that, and not just in an individual way, but also in a communal way. And that's, of course, also the monastic tradition, what the monastic tradition is. And yeah, I mean, in a way, for Augustine, the church experience is really, again, he's inside that. So when you look at the kind of pictures of the way he lived as a bishop in Hippo, it was in the middle of a monastic community with a garden and a library and a nice building.
Yes.
And then, of course, he was traveling a lot, but he was not like a bishop who would be out there with, say, lots with lay people and running around with ordinary people. They would come to the church. So in a way, that's a different kind of church as you have it, you experience it today. And again, I think one has to probably to take that seriously, and saying, in that sense, Augustine is not a modern bishop, is not the image of a modern bishop or a modern pastoral cleric.
Can I ask
that's very helpful.
A question? Yeah. Before I do, the quote on chastity, I was thinking that, I guess for Father David, the quote would be, help me to quit smoking, but not quite now. It's just a shame everyone's muted, isn't it? Anyway, so I was, and this might be just generally a helpful thing to think about, is a lot of people that I've spoken to about St. Augustine from my church back in Oxford don't particularly like him, and it seems they don't like him because of this question of sin and the way he engages in sin. You've touched on this already. I was just wondering, in terms of a clarification on what he means by this. Firstly, in a sense, what does he mean? What does he mean by sin? And I guess the Neoplatonism will come into that. Because he doesn't talk about sin in terms of it being like a power within us, or a substance that competes with God. So it's clearly not something that necessarily has that is that's going to win the day. And what specifically, what does he mean by this thing, original sin, as a point of clarification?
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, and that is the problematic concept. So I think sin, as in terms of kind of making yourself guilty by acting unethically, nobody could have a problem with that, I suppose. I mean, this is like a given. So in antiquity, so that wasn't the issue. The issue was that in exploring, and this is, as some of you were mentioning, this becomes explicit in 396, around the time he's writing the Confessions. He basically says that so the original sin is the sin committed by the first human beings, so Adam in particular, and it's being inherited in a physical way through physical procreation. And he goes even, there's kind of physically, right? So there is no other way. And even though sin itself, of course, is not a physical reality, but that is, there's in a way, at that level, it hardly matters whether you are, say, kind of more stoic, materialistic, or more Platonic, and say immaterialistic. The point is that you are sinful without ever having made yourself guilty. So you are born a sinner. You are born a sinful human being. The baby that is born is a lump of sin. That's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but because he has to defend himself and saying, if this baby is born and dies, that baby will not be in heaven. There's no way. And unless it is baptized, this literally speaking, I mean, there's kind of, it can't be really in hell like the kind of people who have really done evil things, but it's not in heaven. So this is a huge problem. I mean, if he went on and on about this in the later period, and he argued himself more and more into a corner. That's why, and there were these newly discovered sermons in the 1990s, where there was one sermon where he's actually speaking. He's addressing parents whose unbaptized babies died, and he's trying to console them by telling them that even though their babies might be not in heaven, but they should still have hope. So in a way, I mean, what a kind of a pastoral challenge he was putting on himself, just because of his theology. He couldn't think outside this box. And that's a very problematic aspect of his thought. But he applied that to himself too, and that is what's behind, and that's also why people in his time, like Pelagius, for example, it is said that Pelagius read the Confessions in the early 400s, and he was appalled to read this and saying, this is not Christianity. We as human beings, God created us good. God gave us the power to do good. That's the grace we have, even by being created by God. We don't need some extra grace for that. But so that makes Augustine different from, and that's also why he has this really, really bad press, even in theology. And that's not, I don't think, and in a way, I mean, I am saying this now because I've been asked to say what's in the Confessions, but this has been part of Christian tradition for a long time, and it's not, and because Pelagianism was being condemned in the West, there were attempts to make sense of this kind of doctrine, and to somehow mitigate its implications, which is very difficult to do. And what you have, I mean, from my perspective, I somehow, as a theologian, so kind of looking at it theologically, I tend to see these two things as complementary, because I believe that it is not totally, you can't totally dismiss this idea of Augustine because of the simply the abyss that is evil. And you know, humanity is not just good, you know, and it's not just because people are doing bad things. So the evil that is powerful in the world is not just there because of the accumulation of the bad deeds human beings are committing. No, there's more than that. But how to then to define, how to think about it theologically is another question. And clearly Augustine pushed the boundaries very hard in a very difficult, you know, in this direction.
Brilliant, thank you. Are there any other questions out there from the floor? I'm just scanning the crowd right now. Oh yes, I do see that Father David has a question.
Professor, you brought up at the very beginning, the kind of passion behind the confessions being desire. Where we've seen a kind of trajectory of the place of eros in the spiritual life, and particularly as we go over the weeks coming with Boethius and with Dionysius and ending with Dante. Where do you think Augustine kind of is placed within this kind of affirmation of desire, or the place of desire in the spiritual life? Like, it's not just fast, fast, fast. It's this desire that you have that's motivating every action is actually part of your spiritual life. How important is the Augustine moment in that kind of flow?
Good question. But with these other thinkers you mentioned, maybe, although that's probably a bit of a long shot, that only Dante would be someone I could think that would be closer to Augustine, because in Boethius and Dionysius, they are much more philosophical, much more rational. You know, it's difficult to tell. They're more, if you like, systematic philosophical. So they're more metaphysical, if you like. And that's not Augustine is not that. Augustine is more existential, more literary. So he's not, he doesn't work from a preconceived metaphysics. I mean, he's after all a rhetorician, and so he, again, if you go, for example, into the in Book 8, one of the most confusing things in Book 8 is this thing about the two wills, where because he tries to express things which cannot be expressed, and which a serious philosopher wouldn't even try to express because they are contradictory. And so he is, for example, he's saying, how is this possible that the desire which I have, say, towards, say, sexual gratification, and the desire for spiritual kind of illumination, or for a spiritual high mystical kind of experience, how is it possible to think of these as the same thing? They can't be of the same nature. And if you do, then you know, there are lots of pitfalls there, as we know also from history. You know, that people are mistaking one for the other, and philosophers simply, and Boethius would be one of those. I mean, I don't know Dionysius so well, but he would simply say, no, I mean, forget about it, and you make a strict distinction. This is this and this is this. That's it. Don't, you know, don't try to get an existential feel for it. But Augustine wants to feel it. Augustine or at least he wants to talk about this experience in an existential way. And I think that's what makes him different. And that also why he doesn't quite fit into into this other category. Similar with later with later thinkers in the Middle Ages, and even with earlier, say for example Ambrose. Ambrose also wouldn't do that. He's much more disciplined when it comes to using theological concepts. And we know because he actually translate, like Ambrose, they would translate Greek stuff into Latin, and then they would be very careful not to mess with it too much. Whereas Augustine actually doesn't have, he is creative. He gets an idea and then he develops it himself into something that is his. And I think that's not very theological, really. I mean, this is not what theologians normally do, because as a theologian, you are in a tradition and you have to see that the ideas of the fathers, and then they have to still be recognizable. If you have innovation, then that can be a seed of heresy, you know, it can be a problem. And I think he's, but I'm rambling, I think. The thing is that if you, as we said right at the beginning, that the confession had their own tradition. So the people were reading the confession, and I can only think, for example, in the time of Dante, for example, Petrarch was a famous fan of Augustine, you know, and he even, and this was actually, that's an interesting aspect of the reception, because Petrarch in that period actually could convince some Greeks of translating Augustine into Greek, and saying, actually, this is not so foreign to what you are also what you are interested in, and recognizing this. But it was really because it was Augustine, and Augustine brought this to life for those who read him.
I think that Father Tom Platt has a final question that will wind everything up for us.
It's just actually it's just less a question than building on what you've just been saying. I've just been, I mean, again, thinking about the passage where he says, "Later, I loved you," and so on. He talks about falling on the beauties of this world and not realizing that in a way they are vehicles to the greater beauty, and the beautiful, the good, the true. And what I find very attractive about Augustine is his Platonism. In The City of God, is it 8 or 9, where books 8 or 9, where he's talking about Platonism, he talks about the world being, of course, fundamentally good, coming from the goods, but it's the defect in our will, because we're made of nothing, that makes us react to the world badly. So he has the example, doesn't he, of a beautiful woman. One person falls head over heels and exercises the ill will of lust, and the other person sees her beauty as a reflection of the beauty of the divine. So am I right in thinking that, well, I suppose, is this a difference between later Augustine and earlier? Does he see the world and the universe as fundamentally good? And is that utterly obliterated by the defect of our will, because we're made from nothing?
Yeah, but I think that's exactly brings it to the point. I mean, both applies, both ideas apply. The problem, you know, making it out of or being made out of nothing in itself is not that, it's not evil. Evil is coming, as you say, it's coming from the will. So it's the actual the ability, and of course that's coming from freedom. And he's very careful then again to say, no, don't blame it on freedom, or don't blame it on the creation, but all these things have their proper function. But if you are a free being, a being, a spiritual being created freely, and of course the first beings, as far as he is concerned, this wasn't even the human beings, it was actually the angels, and then the chief angel who then is doing precisely that. He's, instead of actually then recognizing the good in this, is actually looking for something more away from that good. That's evil. So in a way, sorry if I'm bringing another thought of it. You know, this is actually what's called privatization.
Mm.
You know, if you say you have a common good, which
privation
is
of the good,
a common good, so that's what God creates, and then the person for whose benefit it is created, is saying, actually, it's very nice to have that just for myself.
Mm.
That's evil. Yeah, and that's so. So he says, you know, and it comes from this kind of idea, so that this being that's been created forgets that who creates it. He thinks just, I'm existing. That's great. Forget about why I'm existing. I'm not interested in that. I'm existing, and so I'm taking everything for myself now. And so that's of course Satan, or so the original being who is doing that, and then, you know, human beings fall into the same trap, and not just as individuals, but as a species. So, you know, that's what we are trapped in. So here you have both realities. You know, he says the fact that everything is created good is never disappears. It's there, and but of course the power to spoil it is also there, and it's always there, because God himself provides it, you know, in the expectation that it's actually in the long. And this is the connection with the East, because I always believe there is a secret connection between apokatastasis and Augustinianism, that in the long run there is no way that the good cannot prevail. It's simply impossible that the good cannot prevail. God is not going away. And the creation is, and we cannot destroy creation. You know, no created being can destroy, because God made it. God could destroy it, but he won't. Right? And so, you know, in the end, it will all be good. Sorry, this is in a way a funny way to end a kind of a little talk about Augustine, but I think deep down Augustine also believed that. He does, of course, if you you have read probably books 21 and 22 of the City of God. He has a way of presenting this, but there are as an orator, there he has this panorama of how it's going to look like in the end. But if you dig down, there are aspects there. In fact, the very end of the City of God, if you look at the very last words of the City of God, he gives away. He almost says that. So that goes a little bit beyond the confessions now. But I think there is still hope in Augustine. That's probably why I have to tell that myself, because I'm still engaging with him.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a sense of grace not destroying nature but perfecting it.
Yeah.
I don't think that was a strange way to finish a talk on the confessions at all, but rather it really gives voice to the sort of exhilaration, frankly, that some of us will undoubtedly have felt. I found this whole discussion profoundly helpful and fascinating, and I want to thank you on everybody's behalf for being with us tonight. I think that we've put you through your paces, but it's worked for all of us. And
no, thank you. That
thank
was
you.
really fine. It was really good.